I'm Carol Bacak-Egbo, historian for Oakland County Parks. Join me now for an episode of History in Our Parks.
From forest to farm to parkland to gravel pit to ORV park. A Hollyoaks County Park story. Hollyoaks ORV Park is located in two townships, Holly Township and Groveland Township. That area was first surveyed in 1816 by Joseph Wampler. In his survey notes, he described it as rolling land with white and black oak and hickory. Those hills and those trees would present a bit of a challenge to people who came to farm the land. In 1830, people had found their way up into Holly and Groveland Townships, ready to take on that challenge. They had followed the same trail Native Americans had been using for hundreds of years. The very first people to actually purchase land that would become the park were Edwin Fairchild and Marston Richards. They purchased it in 1831. But it appears that they were from New York and never left New York. They were land speculators and soon sold the land off. But James Ludington, he purchased land in 1838 and 39 and in fact lived on the land. James had come to Michigan from New York as a bachelor, and in 1843 he married Hannah Jackson. Hannah was from a farm just 2 miles to the east of James Ludington. It was like marrying the girl next door, a common practice in the days before eHarmony or Match.com. Sadly, James died in 1854 and was buried in Little Hadley Cemetery nearby. That cemetery is along Dixie Highway and actually borders Hollyoaks. James's widow and his son kept part of the farm going, but they did sell off a big chunk of it to George Seaman. George Seaman and his wife Elmira had 11 children, but sadly they lost 2 of them in 1854, the same year that James Ludington died. And like James Ludington, they were buried in Hadley Cemetery. A search of Hadley Cemetery records revealed that diphtheria had struck the area in 1854. Austin Holdridge owned a little part of the land that would become Hollyoaks. He also owned a large section to the west. In fact, eventually the Holdridge farm would be 400 acres. Austin Holdridge would die in 1864, and like so many people in the area, would be buried in Hadley Cemetery. His son, William P. Holdridge, would take over the family farm. He had been a soldier in the Civil War, serving in the 3rd Michigan Cavalry. By 1896, his son, William A. Holdridge, had taken over the section of the farm that would become Hollyoaks. He was only 17 when he took the farm over. 2 years later, in 1898, he enlisted in the 33rd Michigan Infantry and fought during the Spanish-American War. Sadly, he contracted tuberculosis during the war, and that would eventually lead to his death in 1900. The Holdridge family is still remembered in the area. Holdridge Road forms the northern boundary of our park, and Holdridge Lake's mountain bike area is just to the west. By 1908, John Lindsay had purchased the Holdridge farm. He'd been a streetcar motorman in Detroit. The Ludingtons still owned some of the land. In fact, they'd even increased their holdings. And a section of it was owned by Dr. C.P. Felshaw, who owned the land but didn't live on it. He actually lived in Holly in a house where he practiced medicine. By 1925, Julius Haas had purchased the Ludington and Felshaw lands. He also owned a section of land on the other side of Dixie Highway. He was a wealthy Detroit banker and had a huge mansion on Grand Boulevard in Detroit. He'd become interested in wildlife preservation, and it appears that he purchased the land in Groveland Township because of that. In 1947, that land had been purchased by the Michigan Department of Conservation, which also owned a lot of land to the west. The intent was to build a recreation area on the land. It would eventually become Holly Recreation Area. But in 1962, I-75 was completed between Pontiac and Flint, and that cut off 2 sections of the parkland. Therefore, the state decided to sell the piece of land that was located between I-75 and Dixie Highway. That brought about huge changes. What had been farmland and recreation land was now being mined for sand and gravel. And those gravel pits became Holly ORV Park. From forest to farm to parkland to gravel pit to ORV park. A story of changing landscapes.